Hello, today we are going to discuss the essay Tradition and Individual Talent written by T.S. Eliot. This essay was published in 1919 in the book The Sacred Wood. T.S. Eliot is famous for advocating objectivity in art. In the essay, Eliot attempts two things. First, he defines and explains the term tradition. And second, he discusses why poetry should be impersonal. Eliot was writing this essay in post-war period when the general public needed strong ideas to overcome disillusionment of war. Eliot wrote against the romantic style of poetry, which was written in romantic period. Now coming to this topic, tradition. I quote from the essay, "We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously." So, in these lines, T.S. Eliot says that we always praise those poems in which there is no tradition and in which we keep on finding the originality of the poet. But T.S. Eliot says that the best parts of the poem can be in which the dead poets or their style of poetry can be seen. Next topic is relation between past and present. Tradition does not mean blindly adhering to the predecessors. Tradition, this term has a much wider significance. The quality of writing in the flow of tradition cannot be inherited, and it can only be obtained by great labor. So T.S. Eliot says that if a poet writes according to the traditional style, then he will have to do great labor by understanding all the poets who wrote before him. So it's a task of great labor. It involves the historical sense. I quote, "The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer has a simultaneous existence and order." Another quote is, "No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone." So T.S. Eliot wants to emphasize that a poet should have the historical sense, which means that he should know what is the importance of the poems written by all the past writers. This is the historical sense, and he doesn't have any value, any importance alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. So, because he is usually judged by comparing with dead poets. Next, he talks about the existing order of poetry. The order means all the poets who wrote in the past. That is the existing order. The existing order of whole work of poetry is complete before the new work arrives. And after the new work, the order is altered. This is the conformity between the old and the new. Just like a building. A building is complete, and when a new work comes, the building changes. The past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. A poet is judged by the standards of the past, but not amputated by them. Therefore, the poet must be very conscious of the main current. He must be aware of the fact that art never improves, but the material of art is never quite the same. He must be aware that the mind of Europe and the mind of his own country are more important than his own private mind. I quote, "The conscious present is an awareness of the past." There is an objection that can arise. The objection is that too much erudition is required if Eliot's method is followed. It can even be affirmed that such learning deadens or perverts poetic sensibility. Eliot advises that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. Next topic is impersonal theory of poetry. A poet should surrender his own private emotions in his poetry because he is committed to something more valuable. The progress of an artist is in continuous self-sacrifice and a continuous extinction of his personality in his poems. In this depersonalization process, art may be said to approach the condition of science. Eliot gives an analogy of a chemical reaction to explain the mind of a mature poet. When a bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide, the chemical reaction takes place and sulfurous acid is formed. This reaction takes place only if platinum is present as a catalyst. The newly formed acid contains no trace of platinum, and platinum also remains unaffected. The mind of the poet is like the catalyst platinum, which means that just like in the chemical reaction, platinum only acts as a catalyst and does not itself takes part in the chemical reaction. Similarly, the poet is also only a catalyst. He himself does not take part in the formation of a poem, which means that his private emotions do not take part in the formation of a poem. I quote, "The more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the man which creates." So a poet has to make this self-sacrifice. He doesn't have to pour his private emotions into the poetry. His vision is much larger. And that is why the man who suffers is completely separate from the man who creates. A poem is created by, now Eliot talks about the process of formation of a poem. A poem is created by emotions and feelings. It is the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure of situations under which the fusion takes place. I quote, "The poet doesn't have to express a personality, but he is only a medium in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. These experiences are not private, rather have a larger vision. It is not in poet's personal emotions that the poet is in any way remarkable or interesting." This is impersonal theory of poetry, which means a poet has to be impersonal while writing poetry. This is depersonalization process. Now the Eliot talks about new emotions being used in poetry. So he says one error of eccentricity in poetry is to seek for new human emotions to express. And in this search for novelty in the wrong place, it discovers the perverse. So Eliot advises that the business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones. Eliot says that emotions recollected in tranquility is also an inexact formula. The concentration of emotions in a poet does not happen consciously or deliberately. So this means that the emotions, they are not a conscious or deliberate process. Writing a poem is not a deliberate or conscious process. It happens automatically when the fusion of emotions and feelings, or the concentration of emotions and feelings takes place. So these were the main topics in the essay, tradition and individual talent.